Okay, let's look at the basic structure of applets, which is substantially different than the basic structure of desktop apps, which use main as their entry point. Applets need two pieces, a Java class and an HTML file. Let's look at the Java class first. So to begin with, you have some import statements. Import statements tell Java which folders to look in for the classes that you reference inside of your code. So later, I refer to the applet class and the graphics class. If I didn't have any import statements, Java would look for those classes in the current package and in the standard Java system library, which is java.lang. By using import statements, you tell Java to look in subfolders relative to your local project's root folder and to the Java standard file root folder. Okay, so you start with import statements, then you subclass, you extend applet. So if you remember the earlier example where we tried to make a static method that takes an array of mixed circles, rectangles, and squares and sums them up. And the problem we had with the naive approach is that if we declared the array to be of type object, then Java wouldn't know in advance that each object has a getArea method. So we made an abstract parent class or an interface called shape so that Java knew ahead of time that all of the objects would have a getArea method. Same idea with applet. By extending applet, you guarantee to Java that your application will have certain methods. And this is critical because the applet is called internally by the browser. The browser is going to call certain methods in your applet, whether you write those methods or not. So your code will not run in a browser unless you extend applet. Okay, so you have some import statements. You extend the applet class. And then you typically have three pieces. You have some instance variables. Most classes have instance variables. If applets need instance variables, put in instance variables. You have some initialization, and you have some drawing. Okay, instance variables are clear. We know what instance variables are already, but init and paint are something brand new, so let's look at those in a little more detail. So the idea of init is that it's called only once when the browser first loads the applet into memory. Now, you would think that a constructor is a natural place to put initialization. That's what we've done before. But the problem is that some of the initialization that an applet needs to do involves things like loading images. And to load images, the applet and the browser need to talk to each other. And the applet can't talk to the browser until the applet is finished being created. And so the constructor is too early. So that's a long and complicated explanation. But the point is that init is the place that you put initialization that you want to happen only once. If you don't have anything that needs to happen only once, or you just need to instantiate an instance variable and give it a default value, you can just do that the normal way. So if you don't have any initialization, you don't have to put in an init. You don't have to put in an init with an empty body. Just don't put in an init at all. Leave it off totally. But I would say that the majority of applets need some one-time initialization, so the majority of applets have an init method. The majority of applets also do some drawing. Paint is the lifecycle method that you override to put in your drawing. So when the applet is first loaded into the browser's memory, the browser instantiates it and then calls init. After that, the browser calls paint. But paint can be called many times by the browser. If you cover up the applet and you re-expose it, the browser calls paint again. If you go to another web page and come back to the web page that contains your applet, the browser calls paint again. If you minimize your browser and then you open it back up again, the browser calls paint again. If you cover up your browser with some other application and then re-expose it, the browser calls paint again. So your drawing operations should be in paint, not in init, so that they get redrawn whenever your window has been at least partially obscured. Okay, so always have import statements, always extend applet. Usually, you have some instance variables. Usually, you have some initialization. Usually, you have some drawing. But none of these are required. If you don't need any instance variables, don't put any in. If you don't need any initialization, don't write an init method at all. If you're not going to do any drawing, you're just going to say play some music, you don't need a paint method. Okay, that's the Java piece. There's also an HTML piece. So in the body of your HTML page, you need an applet tag, and it has three things, or a minimum of three things. First, and most importantly, is the code attribute, which refers to the Java class that you just created. And then you stick the Java class and the HTML class in the same folder. You put them on a web server. You load the HTML page, and then the browser automatically requests the Java applet from the web server. And then you can give it a width and a height. That's the size of the box that the browser will reserve for running the applet. Inside of the applet tag, you can have a message. That message is ignored if Java runs properly, but on the internet, most people have Java disabled in their browsers, and so the error message will show up rather than the Java code. All right, so if you run it in real life, where you make an HTML page that links to the applet, you load it in a browser from a web server, you have a problem during development that browsers cache the applets. In other words, the applets are stored locally. And so the problem with this is during development, when you modify your applet and you change it and you recompile it and you put the new class file on the web server and you reload the browser, it doesn't get the new applet because the applets are cached in a different place. So the solution is a pretty simple one, which is we don't really care about real life applets. We only care about applets to illustrate a bunch of other things that we'll use frequently through the rest of our Java development process. So it's not really important that we ever deploy our applets when we're learning to a web server. And it's not really important that we really run them in the browser. In fact, it's not even really important that we make an HTML file. So Eclipse has a nice little trick. You can just write a Java class and never write an HTML file. And then you right-click inside the Java class and you say, run as Java applet. When you do that, Eclipse creates an HTML file temporarily, and then it calls this little mini program called applet viewer and passes it the HTML file. You're restarting it every time. You're not using a real browser. You don't have to worry about caching, and it's far simpler. You never have to write an HTML file. So although I'll show you in many of the examples what the HTML file would look like if you'd had a real-life applet, when you practice, don't even bother. Now, occasionally, we're going to do some examples where we want to handle data from the person who deploys it, and we need to read some parameters from the HTML. You still don't have to use a real browser. You can still use this little program called applet viewer, but now you have to go to the command line, go to the location your applet is stored. You don't have to deploy it to a web server, and call applet viewer and pass in the file name. But the Eclipse solution handles 80% of the cases. The applet viewer solution handles 20% of the cases. Don't bother when you're learning here. Don't bother deploying everything to a real web server. Just use the Eclipse trick.